Welcome to Delta Talks Allyship 2.0. I'm in conversation with Ilina Logani. Enjoy. Hello, Ilina. I am so thrilled to be in conversation with you today.
Same.
Welcome.
Me too. Lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you again. So welcome to Delta Talks Allyship 2.0. I'm, as you know, I'm thrilled to speak in particular to you about this conversation on this theme. And I would like us to start with a little bit of an introduction. So could you say a little bit more about yourself and how we met and how we kind of led up to this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And please do fill in whatever I miss in terms of that. But I met Doyin through the Rhodes Trust at an event held there. I am a Rhodes Scholar, so I am currently a second-year student at Oxford University, finishing up my MPhil in economic and social history with a background in economics. And originally I'm from Spokane, Washington, which we've discussed is a rural place in the U.S., Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho border for anyone who is familiar. And so much of my work is grounded in advocacy for racially minoritized communities there and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I'm looking forward to hearing more about how some of those experiences in academia, experiences bearing in mind thinking about the different communities you've been involved in, how they come out and how they play up in reality. As you know, many of our listeners and many of the people we work with work in organizations, and I thought it would be really great to have a conversation around, from thinking about lived experience, but thinking about kind of grassroots and working with communities, what some of those insights and perspectives might be for people working in businesses,
absolutely,
people working in organizations. So are you ready for us to start the conversation?
Yes.
Excellent. So let's just start generally with, how you would define allyship.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Easy one, huh?
Yeah.
I want to take a step back because one of the things that I have thought about very recently is, does it count as allyship if you are feeling like you have a personal stake in the issue? Yeah, look at that face, right? I think that the first question I tend to ask myself is am I an ally in this situation, or am I in a position where I'm advocating on behalf of others, but also for myself? If you were to separate out these kinds of messy questions of belongingness and stakeholder perhaps from this question, allyship would very simply, in my mind, be aligning yourself with people who are having experiences of marginalization or disempowerment that are different from your own, which is complicated because so many of our issues are so interconnected.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
I think there is so much wisdom in that. And so I just want to kind of unpack that a little bit, because what are your thoughts around being someone who has experiences of marginalization that are different from others and the extent to which you want to work on behalf of these other communities? Like, what are some of the tensions, or what are some of the benefits of being that individual for whom some marginalized experiences, are familiar, but actually those marginalized experiences on which you want to work on behalf are different? Like, what are the pros and cons of that?
I think so to ground it for folks, I think so just speaking from my perspective, there are multiple ways in which I kind of approach this, from a racialized perspective, from a queer perspective, from someone who's gendered as a woman often. And I think that the pros of that means that I have multiple ways of insight, right? Ways of thinking and empathizing with various modes of how people are being in the world. The cons is that the more lenses you think you have, the more blind sides you also tend to build up, right? I think that it can be really easy to consider that, I occupy a space that means that I tend to look at nuance, and I tend to be kind of looking at the gaps that people are falling into. I think sometimes it's easy to forget the privileges you do have when you start to build up these kind of intersectional positions. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of my own experiences. I haven't shared this with you, but you know that I grew up in Nigeria,
Yes.
and I haven't shared that when I moved from Nigeria to the UK, I became quite aware of two facets of identity that I hadn't been before. So first off, I realized I was Black.
Wild.
I was like, so this is a Black experience. Like, all right, I'm not quite sure what's going on here,
Right.
but there seems to be an exclusion or not quite like a fogginess based on not being part of the more dominant racial ethnic group. But at the same time, I realized how socioeconomically privileged I was. And all of the assumptions I had made about talent and potential and making it and thriving and succeeding, and I had not taken enough time to realize the relationship between my upbringing and the assumptions I made about the success that I was bound to have. And so sometimes I do kind of just pause and check myself and just think about, okay, how much of that is coming from a position of privilege and power and the space that you have access to versus, what are the spaces or voices you need to give to other people. And so I would love to hear some more about, maybe for you kind of personal examples where you've thought,
sure.
all right, I'm in this space, I have I'm thinking about my privilege or potential privilege, sources of privilege, while also having the opportunity to advocate. And I just love any examples what that might look like for you.
I might give two, if that's all right. I think the most recent one, I would say probably in the last, moving to the UK in the last year and a half, so much of the work that I have been doing has been a recognition of the ways in which my own American identity is actually so pertinent to the ways in which I walk through the world. And having been in America this entire time up until, September 2023, I think that I was so used to kind of operating in situations in which I'm used to kind of speaking from below, perhaps, speaking as someone who operates in multiply marginalized contexts, especially elite academic spaces, right? I'm very used to operating in the American context as someone who comes from a racially marginalized background, right? And these other things that we have talked about. And then I came here and realized that so much of the advocacy work that I do is in alignment with my friends and my peers from the Global South, and recognizing that, oh wow, actually it's not just, the very basic minimum what you would think of in terms of passport privilege. It is accent. It is the ways in which my voice is, prioritized in certain spaces, right? Are you leaning in? Do you want to add? Or just
I'm
resonating?
To hear that.
Yeah, right. Because it's so easy for me to find myself in positions of political advocacy because it is my lifeblood. I would say it is what I end up just even accidentally. And, these are the spaces that I feel most human in. And to realize for once that I was surrounded not by fellow Americans of color, but folks from every possible background, and realizing that I needed to take many steps back was a big, good lesson, I think. And similarly, I would say even in the U.S. context, I mean, as a non-Black person of color, there's always, me questioning the ways in which my racialization is playing in a position, whether I'm being considered palatable or not. And feel free to ask me to elaborate in any of this. But, as someone who went to Columbia University, for instance, as my undergraduate, and then went back to my hometown where many people don't end up going to college, or many people who go to college stay in the region, or in local areas. I think that there was a moment of reckoning for me there, that the language that I was building in elite academic spaces was not translatable necessarily in the more rural context I'm from. Are these, yeah.
Oh gosh,
there's a lot in there.
There's a lot in there, but it's also really illuminating to hear. So I know that one of the things I've struggled with is talking about intersectionality in a practical way.
Sure.
So often when we think about intersectionality, we kind of think the theory, we think the concepts, we get the idea of multiple identities, multiple marginalizations. I think with the conversations that I've been having with people, there's an increasing acknowledgement that although we recognize the source of intersectional thinking, that another application goes beyond multiple marginalization. It goes to privilege as well as disadvantage. We often speak to senior white leaders, senior white male leaders, and ask them to think about privilege. And that type of conversation is becoming more and more prevalent. Where my mind is going is the idea of all of us having more of an intersectional awareness. And, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are if we think about what we could, like how we can continue to press on as allies who have an intersectional framing, working with lots and lots of different people who have greater power or less power in organizations. Just what are some of the, I don't know, tips or insights you might have to make, to raise awareness, to kind of hold that awareness of intersectional privileges and disadvantages as you think about collective work that we want to do. I know that's a big question. It is, but I just hear so much like awareness from you of those spaces, and I just wonder, what helps you, what reminds you of the value of those kind of multiple perspectives. Being a student at Columbia and language of elitism, but then thinking about actually my local community. I need to think I need to connect with you in a way that's that
truly
makes sense.
And connect with myself too, because that is where I come from, right? I might ask you to take a step back and ask again, is this a question of how we each think about intersectionality in the spaces that we're in, or how do we best make that intersectionality translatable to people who might not be?
It's probably a bit of both. So let's start with the second one.
Okay.
What are your thoughts about how we make intersectionality more accessible to regular folk at work who are kind of well-intended, but that's all a little bit theoretical for me. Thank you very much.
Fair. I take it. I think that on one level, the way that I would like to make one thing I would like to make known is it's not as simple as adding things on top of each other. It's not a 1 + 1 + 1, right? Oh, I have this identity and this and this, and this means that this is the level of marginalization I experience. I think that is where the theory starts to get a little bit, people start to get a little bogged down is I have to keep thinking about, I have to be aware of the 20 million identities that exist in the world. We are human. We are so complex. There is no way in which anyone can be doing that at any moment. I think for me, the ways in which I do it for myself and the ways in which I might try to make it a little bit more real for people it's something I call noticing the gaps, is something I've used in my work in the past and with my conversations with my peers. And it is simply oftentimes people who hold multiple identities that entail marginalization, whether it is gender, whether it is class, whether it is neurodivergence, right? There's so much you can throw in here. Oftentimes, I have found in my experience that these are the people who are falling in the gaps of whatever work is being done. Either they are holding the brunt of the labor but receiving the least recognition for it, right? Or they are the people who might hold a wealth of knowledge but are being talked over, or being interrupted, or not being pulled into conversational spaces because they are not considered for whatever reason, for whatever soft human reason in terms of even the ways in which people present themselves. They're not considered the authoritative figure in the room. And so for me, the ways in which I would just try to make it as real as possible is to try to throw out this idea of trying to remember what identities every single person holds and try instead to notice who are the people who are not being noticed. If this is making sense, who are the people who are in the gaps, who need to, whose recognition could be added and elevated a little bit more, or who could be made sure that they're not being talked over. Pay a special attention to the ways in which interruptions are happening is something that I think about a lot. Yeah.
Notice the gaps. I love the simplicity of that. And, so what's coming to my mind is, on one hand, when we think about intersectionality, you were talking about, it's actually not about just layers upon layers. And that, what the image that comes to mind, it becomes more, it's thick and it's complex and intertwined and all of that. And your guidance is actually, yes, it's not saying that's not important, but from a practical perspective, just wherever you are, notice the gaps. Who's not speaking, who is not here, who is being interrupted,
exactly,
who doesn't have the space or the voice that I have.
Exactly. Yeah. Precisely.
That.
Yeah.
Okay. Do any examples come to mind where you've inadvertently not noticed the gaps?
Oh. Many. I mean, the was like, yes, I feel like it's always a constant learning process, right? It goes back to what I mentioned in terms of having to take a step back and check myself in so many different ways. I would say probably the most pertinent, there was some hometown advocacy I was doing in 2020, which for those of us, all of us should remember, but 2020 being a particularly pertinent year for racial advocacy across the world, in particular in the United States, in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And there were so many moments, I would say, in kind of that hometown advocacy, specifically working towards racial justice in my schools in my hometown, which can be historically a site of racial violence. And I mean violence I would not use violence lightly. I think oftentimes in corporate spaces and academic spaces, when we use the word violence, we mean as a metaphor. I mean literal, right? So I think that there's something to be said about the fact that in a movement where you're really trying to push back and create spaces that are physically safer, emotionally safer, psychologically safer for the few students of color who exist there, you're gonna stumble into things. I think one of the things I stumbled into was a simple matter of, my voice had a lot of authority. I wrote an op-ed, meant that people put leadership onto my shoulders, meant that people were making eye contact with me when they were having conversations, and meant that people were directing their emails to me. For instance, when I had made it explicit that there were 4 or 5 different people who were, on this team who were doing this work, who needed to be reached out to as well. I think I stumbled in the first few weeks because I didn't, I think, actively work as laterally as I should have. I think that there was a lot of confusion, and what happens in confusion is you recreate kind of hierarchies of power. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's also something to acknowledge in that it is so affirming when you are given the space, when attention is being turned to you. So particularly if you're someone who's, like me, who's, when we think about all of our other identities, find yourself underrepresented in positions of power. So the question that's emerging in my mind is whether we think, this is an open question, do we think it is more challenging or easier to notice the gaps if you yourself have been, on the receiving end, or, have multiple marginalized identities? Is it easier for us to say, actually, no, you know what, I'm going to step back? Or is it more tempting to be like, finally, I have the resources. Yes. I have the ear of people in power. I have the ear of the boss or the CEO. They've made me the head of the ERG, the Employee Resource Group. This is great for my career. I mean, all of those things feel natural.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're so human. Like, I think that's such a normal response. And I love this question because I don't know if I have a clean answer. I think I'm leaning towards, despite all of that, the very act of noticing the gaps is easier, I would say. In my perspective, for someone like me who has operated in multiple gaps, I find it easier to look around the room and notice whose labor is being unrecognized in this space, and who's not just labor in terms of the work that they're doing, but the emotional labor, the presence that they're bringing to the space, the kind of mothering they're doing in the room. And I use mothering in a loose gender way, right? But I think that for me, it is something that almost feels preternatural because it is something that I'm so used to from such a young age. Acting on those gaps, I think, is maybe the second half of your question, is a different bit. And I'm curious to hear what you think about that, because I almost find it easier, or I've almost, in my experience, I've noticed that there are people who, once they're accustomed to noticing the gaps, the more privilege they have, the easier it is for them to actually kind of shed the spotlight a little bit. I think that you're pointing to something very astute, which it is difficult to give up the space once you've been denied it, when you've been denied it for so long and you're given it. What are your thoughts on that? So
I'm hopeful that I think I feel similar to you, and when I think about the people that I've worked with for whom, like the like whatever communities they represent or whatever like aspirations they have, particularly within their organization, I think there's such a deep commitment to it that even like within their own sense of like progress and measuring progress and kind of getting to justice and equity where all forms of talent can thrive, I think that voice internally is loud enough. When I think about the different examples. When I think about examples where maybe I'm not as optimistic, what comes to mind is the context in which they find themselves in, right? So they maybe haven't had the opportunity to. They've had to play the game a lot more, right? They've had to be a lot more of like political animals.
Yes.
And, you and I have spoken about like, the spheres between like the politics and the professional and the personal and the choices, I think people have to make. And so I think what's come into my mind is it's probably not fair to just think of the individual and essentially say, actually, you have access to all of this. You need to make sure you the onus is on you to notice the gaps. That is important, yes. I think I also need to bear in mind the organizational context in which in which different individuals who belong to historically marginalized communities, like, what context or what organizational context they find themselves in and what types of support they have
and how they've gotten
resources.
there. Yes. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
One of the things we talked about was, almost like the opposite end of that spectrum, like being afraid to, like not speaking up, like spotting, like having some awareness, so maybe noticing the gaps, potentially being in a position of privilege.
Sure.
And noticing those gaps and then not doing anything about it. I would just love your thought, because now we're speaking to many people who would consider themselves allies, as well as individuals who generally would self-identify as belonging to more privileged communities, right? So we have someone who belongs to a privileged group, or relatively more privileged set of identities, who notices and then doesn't do anything about it.
Doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Oh,
How
wow.
do we get them to
do something, or to feel comfortable perhaps in the space that
exactly.
the impact they can have here. This is so complicated because I think the decision to choose not to do something has so many layers, right? There's the personal ostracization question of if I do something, am I going to lose my social capital, perhaps, in whatever space I'm in? Then there's the political layer. I operate more in this realm, I will say. I think that oftentimes grassroots organizing, the things that we contend with are, if we do something, who is going to be facing the biggest political backlash? From like not just a social level, but from an institutional level, who is most likely to be reprimanded or to face disciplinary action or to be, have their details shared publicly. These are all questions. I kind of want to take a step back, because, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like you're kind of gearing towards that first, when perhaps the material, tangible consequences are not as severe, but the socio-political consequences in the space you're in feel
correct.
Yes.
However, I love that first point around actually just kind of starting from are other people going to have a worse outcome if they do this versus me?
Exactly.
And if this organization is important to me, if the thing that we're aiming for is, collectively, the thing that I have a role to, I see myself as a leader, I have a role to play in terms of getting this organization where it is. And I'm not going to lose out as much as this other person is.
Right.
I think that's an important first kind of like
first step,
wave of analysis.
Exactly.
Right?
And it is absolutely so linked to intersectionality, because you're saying it, but to be so explicit about it, those are going to be linked to the identities you hold in the space, right? In the political sphere, in the corporate sphere, in the educational sphere, right? Which I'm, the people who have the financial resources, the people who have the visual appearance that makes them maybe less of a threat, right, in an environment. So I think you're right. An absolute good first wave of analysis is to say, if not me, who? And if there is someone else who would, but then face harsher consequences, I don't know. There's a question that I have in my mind of does that build courage in you? Do you have then the sense of, okay, if not me and nobody else, but we have a collective goal we're going towards. But I also want to approach this with a little bit of empathy on that front, because it's so, it's so easy to say, oh, if not me, who? And, and yet the fear exists, Absolutely. Right? And yet the question of, do I say something? How do I say something? Am I going to get it wrong? If I say something and it's the wrong thing, am I going to make it worse? These are all questions that are so natural. I think that the way that I think about allyship, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this, but it's a constant act of love. It's a constant, not to be sappy about it, but it is a constant act of choosing that level of compassion that I think kind of an ethic of care that I feel like is a central kind of North Star in how I think about this work. And in most things, that involve that level of kind of vulnerability that comes with compassion and love, you will make mistakes. It is inevitable. I've made so many mistakes. I'm sure that, looking at you across the table, I'm sure we both can think of many moments where we've misstepped. And I think the self-compassion part of this, of being, yes, I might say something and it might be wrong. I might say something and someone might be hurt, and trusting that you're able to respond to that in a way that is, compassionate both to yourself, but to the person who has been hurt, and say, oh, I'll learn and I'll do better next time. I don't know. Is this resonating?
Totally. You can see me nodding. I love that. I talk about vulnerability a lot with leaders. Talk about compassion, but not in the kind of really powerfully resonant ways that you've just shared. And so I just want to reiterate, there's self-compassion
Absolutely.
And compassion towards others. And that kind of the mix of those two will kind of help you think about, well, you know what, when I'm in that space of vulnerability, self-compassion and compassion, if I make a mistake, that's all kind of like, that's all part of the process. It's
part of the process. It absolutely is. It's what it means to be an ally. No one's born a perfect ally. No one's born a perfect, and you can say this with words even without using the word allyship, but nobody is born a perfect companion to somebody else, right? And if we're thinking about allyship as companionship, as mutual support, I think that, it is a constant learning process.
I love that. So I've written an article recently on what I titled Allyship 2.0. And one of the things that I've said in that article is how at a time such as this, if never before in recent times, we absolutely need to really dig into what allyship means for us and stand up for justice, but also stand up for kind of just equal outcomes and fairness within organizations and in society more broadly. And I think kind of going back to what you're saying around some of the fundamentals of kind of seeing oneself as part of a community, part of others within my organization, thinking about oneself, yes, as a leader, but also someone who's kind of vulnerable and kind of connects to others. I think that just gives it reinforces some of the key messages and reiterates those messages. What I'd like for you to comment on now is, how do we sustain that behavior? I think it's, all of this is well and good, kind of just tune into, notice the gaps. Check the extent to which, you have a little bit more credit in the bank than others. And, if not you, then who? Stay in that space of knowing that you will probably fail and make mistakes, and that's okay. Compassion for yourself, compassion for others.
Right.
But as you've said a number of times in this call, we're human.
Yeah.
Right? And this is, in the hope that, you just kind of take those steps and right. So how do we sustain those steps? And I tell you what, I've been wondering whether we need metrics for allyship in organizations.
Fascinating.
What are your thoughts?
Oh, wow. Metrics. You want hard numbers.
Hard numbers. Because
I'm over here talking about feelings and emotions, and you're like, I want to measure this.
Right. It's so important
fair.
now.
It's fair. Because it's also, part of the gaps is questioning how are we actually knowing if we're noticing these correctly?
Absolutely.
If people who are in the gaps are unable to unable or for whatever reason are not being called in to actually express what their experience is. Wow, good question.
How do we continue to keep a level of confidence and trust that we can instill this type of culture and it is maintained within organizations?
I mean, this is so much your area of expertise than mine, Doyin, but I will say, in terms of metrics, the way that I generally find, if I feel internally, the way that I feel internally that my allyship, my advocacy is landing, is doing the work, is I'm constantly asking the people around me, what do you need? Do you need something more? What is happening? It's a constant listening ear,
Nice.
whatever that looks like in your space, whether it's a survey mechanism, whether it's a just informal conversation, in ways that kind of try to depower the space a little bit, right? To bring it on a peer level rather than like an authority and someone speaking from below level, to try to dismantle those and just truly, again, it does come back to just being human, but I would say just like a genuine like listening connection. Because for me, it's just been through informal chats, to be quite frank, at the end of the day, which I know is hard to have a metric on, but it is how do you can't expect the numbers to just, or the data to just fall into your lap on that front. It is a proactive way of like proactive listening, maybe. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that because, like you said, there are already mechanisms within organizations to gather data, whether qualitative or quantitative.
Yeah.
But turning what I'm loving about what you're saying is kind of turning it to the other members of your organization, other kind of colleagues, and the impact that you're having on them. That is, kind of getting data on that in whatever format and whatever we call it gives you an idea of the progress that you're making.
Yes.
And gives you opportunities to pivot if you need to or to adjust. I think that. I think that could work.
Could work,
actually,
right? Like
could work.
It's just a question of, I think sometimes we presume that the mechanisms we have in place work, but if they're being passively, operating, if they're passively operating, thank you. I think that there's a question of the people who are multiply marginalized. Are you actually being measured in that, or are you kind of, that's a gap that you're escaping through? So that's the proactiveness. It's the kind of the act of reaching out to say, hey, what more? Before having people come to you and saying, I need more.
Absolutely. And I think I would also add some measures or some indicators of accountability.
Yeah.
I think there is listening, taking it on board, and just kind of holding oneself or a collective responsible for responding and showing that they've responded.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I feel like there's so many other places this conversation could go.
Gosh.
There is a lot in there that you've shared, and I genuinely appreciate your time and your insights,
Thank
Ilina.
you so much.
Was there anything else that you were thinking that, might be helpful? So again, our listeners are generally within organizations. Many people I anticipate will be tuning in because they're thinking, actually, how do I put into practice allyship, and how do I bear it in mind what's going on in the world? What are some of the different or small ways in which I can just start from a practical perspective to live that identity of an ally or advocate, which I've heard you use.
Yes. That's the word I tend to use, advocate.
Yes. Actually, could I ask a little bit
Yeah,
about that?
please.
Tell me what the similarity or difference is between ally and advocate.
Oh, wow. Put me on the spot here. Partially, I think I use the word advocate because ally feels, I think sometimes ally to me feels like a word that in common parlance has lost a little bit of meaning in my worlds. I think that people will use ally glibly without the work of allyship. Advocacy, in my mind, perhaps definitionally is the same thing, but it requires such a level of constant work that I think for me, it just feels like the kind of word I want to use, because, I can never be a passive advocate, right? I think I have seen passive allies. So you know what I mean? So that is why I use
crystal
that
clear.
word.
I love that. Passive allyship. Boom. Oh, gosh. So I want to just do a little segue into why I wrote this paper, because what you've just said speaks so powerfully to the underlying reason for me, in terms of why I thought, I just need to write this. So in uncertain times such as this, definitely from a psychological perspective, right? You're kind of you're starting to question, who am I actually? I need to almost rather than reach out, I need to just narrow in, right? And kind of protect myself and just kind of focus on what I absolutely. And what I'm hearing you say is, when sometimes we overuse the expression allyship, and we need to think quite intentionally about being more mindful, using, for example, the label advocacy, which then puts a lot more, that's more of a doing, right?
For me, yes.
In it, right? I can see it.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking in the lead up to the new administration and in the US and all of the changes in the world, I was thinking a few months ago that we needed to remind people that the work continues, right? And in these uncertain times, people are looking to their leaders to be that stabilizing force. This is still important. This is where we're going. I've been working with some clients recently, and they were talking about their leaders coming together and reiterating, these are our values, this is what matters. And as I'm thinking about those conversations, I want to introduce what you've kind of really so powerfully reminded me of, about the being mindful and intentional in the work that you're doing. The intentionality. Right. We've done a series of programs with senior leaders, which we call the Ally Acceleration Program. And one of the things at the heart of it is a group of people, a group of leaders kind of just checking in with each other, sharing best practices or kind of what things that they've learned, things that they're still learning, they're stumbling over. And I'm just going to that message around kind of mindful intent is going to kind of continue to resonate. That's one of the many gifts you've given me in this conversation, Ilina. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much for giving it.
Yeah.